Okay, so I am absolutely delighted to be part of this symposium, as I have over the years developed a great interest on technology innovation, and I will be chairing the panel for you this morning on U.S.-China S&T cooperations. And we have two speakers today. One is my colleague Richard Sattmeyer, who I've known for many years, who has written extensively on the subject of science cooperation, U.S.-China science cooperation, and the former Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs, Chow Jung-Hwai, who will also be a discussant on scientific and technological cooperation between the Chinese and the United States government. U.S.-China cooperation in science technologies have a very, very long history. There has been American companies actually made a tremendous inroad in China in the Republican period and made a number of strides. There was a tremendous amount of innovation. Also, American telegraphers, I think, worked extensively in China in developing the telegraph. And the United States also has one of the longest living projects, on technology cooperation. Actually, the site selection for the Three Gorges Dam was selected by John Savage, who was an American engineer who actually was the person who located the Hoover Dam. And so this cooperation has gone for a very long time. It was suspended when China decided to bring the Three Gorges Dam. But overall, we had a very fruitful history of S&T cooperation. So I'm looking forward to this session, and it has not been without a set of obstacles and a set of problems at times. So I'm really looking forward to how our speakers will explore this very important topic. So, Richard, you have the floor now from 11:05, say, to 11:30, and we will try to give you your full 25 minutes.
Okay. Thank you, Marco. And I need this, I think. Huh?
And also, if you can pick up speed without undergoing undue risk, then
we'll try. Well, I think it is, first of all, let me thank the Kissinger Center for inviting me. I think it's a great event to have discussions.
There's no microphone. He's not talking into the microphone. The interpreter can't hear anything he's saying.
Building bilateral platforms for today's big challenges. And I'll come back to that theme a little bit as we go forward. We should, I think, maybe start, even though we could go back well before 1979, it's useful, I think, to think about this initial agreement between the two governments on the occasion of Deng Xiaoping's visit, and I think Minister Zhao will say a little bit more about that also. But what I wanted to do was just to have a quick then and now kind of comparison. At that time, of course, the U.S. really was kind of the unchallenged leader of research and innovation for the most part. China was coming through. China was just emerging from the Cultural Revolution. Its R&D system was very disrupted. And we lived in a certain Cold War geopolitics. Now, of course, things have changed very, very dramatically. The U.S., I think, is still a leader in research and innovation, but things have obviously changed. We have to qualify that somewhat. China is on a very rapidly rising trajectory of scientific and technological development, as Minister Liu pointed out. And I think we're also in a period of great geopolitical uncertainty, which affects the relationship. In addition to all of that, I thought I would just like to say a word picking up on Dr. Hughes's points about the changing nature of innovation. The World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, produced an interesting report here in the last year on the changing face of innovation, noting in particular this whole idea of the shifting geography of innovation. So these days when we talk about the world of innovation, you can't really exclude East Asia in ways that you might really have done so 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Internationalization as well, so that more and more research, more and more innovation is actually occurring cross borders. It is more collaborative, by and large, both in terms of the value stream itself, the upstream, downstream levels, but also horizontally in terms of potential competitors actually are often cooperating as well. And in all of that, this intellectual property question, maybe not surprisingly coming from WIPO, gets a lot of attention, right? More and more intellectual property has become a central issue in business strategies. And there's lots of interesting data to reinforce that as well. So with that as a quick background, let's just think for a little bit about how this thing developed after 1979, this relationship. First of all, we saw almost immediately the beginning of a surge of Chinese students coming to the United States, students and scholars. China in the 1980s began to put together the elements of a technology transfer regime which facilitated foreign investment, which facilitated technology transfer and made a big difference. The World Bank, we should remember, played a very important role in helping to build up universities, build up national laboratories that were mentioned, and engineering research centers. And in all of that, we began to see the beginnings of very significant changes in the Chinese innovation system, starting in the 80s and continuing today, as Minister Liu pointed out. And out of all of this has come now this sort of what I've called here the multi-channel engagement. So when we talk about U.S.-China relations in research and innovation, I think we have to always be very conscious of the fact that there are these different channels and there's a lot of activity going on in each, as we'll say in a moment. Jumping ahead maybe 10 years, we begin to see what has become a well-established relationship now being driven by some new factors, right? After 1992, we have a very significant surge in foreign investment beginning to happen in China. We're beginning to see that many of the scientists and engineers or students who came to the United States in the 80s now are taking tenured positions in American universities, working in American companies, and providing a new kind of bridge for a relationship. Again, domestically in China, the reform process continues in all of this, leading in part of economic policy as well to WTO accession, which I think has a big impact actually on innovation issues in China. And then in the context of all of that, some very difficult political issues begin to surface, first of all from Tiananmen incident, which had the effect of interrupting a lot of activities with the United States. And then later in the 90s, the issuance of the report of the COSC Commission, which again began to cause some problems, I think, in the relationship by calling attention to what was alleged to be Chinese misbehavior. So, interesting process, right? Lots of interesting new drivers, of momentum builds up, big bumps on the road, as Marco pointed out, but nevertheless, significant progress. Today, we are seeing the working out of these multiple streams. And let me just say a word quickly. I think Ambassador Tao will say a little bit more about this as well. But in the terms of government programs, we have many different protocols in many different fields. The protocols, the government-to-government relationship, as many of you know, I think is overseen by a joint committee that is chaired by the Minister of Ministry of Science and Technology and the President's Science Advisor, in this case, Dr. Holdren. And then we have more recent innovations, more recent developments, such as this innovation dialogue, which I'll say a little bit more about in a moment, under the general auspices of the strategic and economic dialogue. In industry, big activities as well, right? We often focus on a lot of these, especially in Washington, I think. The technology transfer story is a very interesting story that has many different phases, from what happened in the 1980s, changing to the 1990s, but driven, I think, certainly in the 1990s and subsequently by foreign investment opportunities and the nature of the Chinese technology transfer regime, often referred to as the market for technology regime. But in addition to that, we should also see the growth of this R&D activity by foreign companies in China. The last count, there was something like 1,300 significant R&D centers in China, not all of them American, but a lot of them being that way, as well as lots of activities going on with foreign companies and institutes of the Chinese Academy of Sciences and universities. And some of those, I think, are perhaps quite important for joint innovation activities. In all of that, I think we see, again, possible conflicts, possible frictions, certainly issues. On the Chinese side, I think there's a feeling that always people are asking the question, is this foreign presence in our innovation system serving us well, or is it serving the foreigners more? And of course, certainly in Washington, it doesn't take too long in a discussion of this topic to get people saying, you know, what are the American companies doing, transferring all kinds of additional knowledge, know-how, skills, and so forth through these R&D investments in China. In the academic realm, great activity as well. Here, of course, I think it's mainly the individual scientists who have carried the ball quite a lot. All of this investment in training that was made has built relationships between professors and their students. Those have led to cooperative relationships subsequently. Gradually, I think the U.S. has been slower than Europe and Japan, especially Europe. Gradually, we're seeing more institutional ties as opposed to just individual project activities. But in all of this, we're beginning now to see, I think, this very interesting phenomenon of the Chinese research environment selectively now becoming very important as a magnet for foreign researchers, including lots of unemployed American postdocs who have trouble getting jobs here. But with all of the investment China is making in, especially in big science, there are facilities now in China that really are world-class and are attracting people selectively in some fields. And you can see this just by looking at some of the co-authoring trends. My apologies, this is data only to 2005, but if you extended it, it would go a little bit further. So what this is really doing is telling us who does China collaborate with in terms of joint research. And the black line at the top is the US. And you can see, I think, in all of that, some of the consequences of the growth of a Chinese, ethnic Chinese community in the United States and American universities collaborating with partners back in China. The others, Japan is the second largest on this graph as well. One of the things that, again, I think that Minister Cha will say something about, but I mention it here because I think it really is a very interesting new departure in this whole relationship. And that is the establishment of this CERC, right, Clean Energy Research Center. It's interesting, I think, because what it does is, for the first time, really pulls together in a systematic way all three of those streams, the government, the academic, and the commercial, right? And what the two sides have done is they've created these consortia of government, industry, and academics to work on these three critical problems: advanced coal technology, energy efficiency, and clean vehicle technologies. And what you can see, I think, is that the leaders of these consortia represent this mixed institutional pattern, right? So you have, in the coal case, University of West Virginia, representing the U.S. side, Huaneng as a company representing the Chinese side. In energy efficiency, Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory representing the government side, Tsinghua representing the university. So it's a very interesting point. Okay, going back to my title slide, I think it is very useful for us to think about what this now 30 more years of relationship has provided in terms of significant assets for the two countries and for others. And I would say that we should think about these again maybe in terms of these, what I've called here, different platforms. So the government-to-government thing in particular has provided a whole range of assets for working on very, very significant problems of public goods, environment, energy, problems of risk and regulation, et cetera, et cetera. In the commercial side, again, many, many opportunities that are available as a result of the existing sunk costs, the existing platforms that exist. Clearly, in each of these cases, there are some issues in the commercial question, commercial high technology area, trying to understand what Zizhu Chuangxin means, and things like that. Conflicts over industrial policy, intellectual property questions, visas, export controls, ongoing problems. But nevertheless, there is a degree of intimate cooperation that in some cases is really quite striking. And of course, in basic research, you have, again, a third platform built upon academic side into the two countries. So let me conclude with a few final thoughts here about some of the things that we might be thinking about in terms of understanding this new stage. In ways that certainly were inconceivable in 1979, we now are in a situation where we have a growing partnership in many of these things, Chinese capabilities having risen so quickly, but at the same time recognizing that in many cases we are also becoming competitors, not only in commercial terms, but I think in competition over, for instance, talent, among other things. In both countries, especially in the face of severe environmental and especially economic questions, I think we're seeing some degree of techno-nationalism emerging, right, where national efforts to build scientific and technological capabilities are thought of largely in terms of national interests only, without a concern for the more global side. On the other hand, in both the United States and in China, we also find many, many manifestations of a kind of techno-globalist perspective as well. Third countries have become very important, obviously. It has been true for the United States for a long time, and increasingly so for China. And as I said, following WIPO, the world of innovation is changing. So a few key challenges here, it seems to me. This question of security issues, I think, is important. We try oftentimes not to address those in the context of science and technology, and maybe that's good. But on the other hand, whether it be export controls, a perennial issue, more recently cybersecurity, there are lots of very significant security questions that enter into this relationship that have to be recognized and addressed somehow. Relatedly, I think there is a question of trust and maintaining trust. On one hand, we have lots and lots of experience of building confidence with the two sides. But on the other hand, we also see manifestations of distrust quite a lot. The IPR issue, of course, is one that keeps popping up in China's industrial policies. China has its own reasons for, I think, questioning some of the US side. And in this context, I think this innovation dialogue is kind of interesting. I'm not sure whether it's going to lead to anything all that significant at this point, but people are hopeful. And yet, if one looks at some of the things that have been said in the context and some of the people involved, you can see that some of them are, in fact, very much oriented towards a China that, on the American side, that is threatening, is breaking the rules, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So these are the same people who are then supposed to be building confidence as we go forward. We could go into some of these other points, but in the interest of time, just note them. I think funding issues for the relationship continue to be important, especially in the U.S. side, and governance and coordination on both sides becomes very important. And again, I think the U.S. has, on balance over the years, failed to take as much advantage of what has been going on with China, largely because we've been asleep at the switch in some sense. So to conclude then, in the final analysis, this issue of globalization kind of comes up again, and I'm just going to conclude with a few reflections, right? Going back to this notion of the changing nature of innovation, what we're really seeing, I think, is a world of networks, right? A world of research and innovation networks. That raises the question of how that relates to, interacts with national innovation systems, which we tend to focus on more often than not. In all of that, we come back also to the question that came up a little bit this morning. Not only is the role of government, I think, in domestic S&T policy critical, it's also very critical for understanding the international possibilities. So on one hand, if we look back on this relationship, we can say that that 1979 framework actually, the agreement set a very good framework for subsequent development of private sector, whether academic or commercial activities. These days, though, I think if you looked at the dynamics, arguably, I think it's the industry and academic networks that are driving an awful lot of the cooperation. And that's true not only with China, but I think internationally. And in all of that, with a country like China as well as India, this whole issue of diaspora influences becomes very important. I don't think you could see patterns of co-authorship the way we see them without looking at the diasporic influences. So I want to just conclude, I'm very close to my time.
Oh, you still have 5 minutes.
With this little network presentation, which I always like very much, which kind of captures, I think, what I'm getting at here about this world of networks. So this is actually based upon real data from around 2005 again, and it represents patterns of cooperation among key players in this global system of innovation. And as of 2005, the U.S. still was the sort of super node, right, the big node out there in this network, and China was a kind of secondary or tertiary node, right, over here. Germany here and a few other OECD countries. Clearly, I think if we were going to update the data, we would see China moving to a much bigger node, for sure. And I think it's fair to say that China really aspires to be there and out there as a supernode with the United States. And the interesting question becomes, I think, how we begin to think about what are the dynamics of that happening? What are the advantages of it happening? I think are many. What are the problems? What are the frictions? And so forth and so on. So that takes us into this really big world of the future of international scientific and technological cooperation, which is outside of my presentation today. There is, I might add, various papers on this subject at that. There are various papers on this subject at that website, the U of Oregon website.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that wonderful presentation that looks both at the past and at the future of science cooperation, not only with the United States, but science cooperation writ large. And now we look forward to the presentation of Vice Minister Chia Jianghua. Let me set up the microphone for you.
Okay, thank you. 尊敬的
Honorable Mr. Kapal, ladies and gentlemen, just now we heard from Professor Sottenmeier about the challenges that we face, as well as the platform that has been set up. It was a wonderful presentation. And now I am going to talk about the S&T cooperation between our two governments. Nowadays, many countries around the world, when promulgating a long-term development strategy, the word that they use most often is the word innovation. It doesn't only include innovation in ideas, it also includes industrial innovation and technological innovation. Innovation has become the key concept for development strategies. The same is true with China. We have institutional innovation, system innovation, technological innovation, which are also very important. So in all these different kinds of innovation, technological innovation undoubtedly has a very special place. In China, one of our long-term development strategies is to invigorate the country with S&T and education. So technological innovation is obvious. China is a large developing country. In terms of technological levels, we are still lagging behind compared to advanced industrial countries. Just now, Mr. Liu, in his presentation, talked about the fact that we are ranked number 21st in terms of technological innovation around the world. In order to innovate, we have to work with other countries. International S&T cooperation is an important juncture where our technological work and our economic work and diplomatic work come together. 30 years ago, we sent a very important message to the world. That is, we want to be part of the world. We want to integrate into the world. And to do that, we have to work together with other countries and at the same time contribute our share to the world development. China is now at a very difficult stage as we step up our development. We are now at a critical time in establishing an innovation-oriented country. We now have to use scientific development to speed up our economic development. We have to develop extensively and use international innovative resources to help us build our innovation capacity. My presentation today I'll talk about the cooperation between our two governments in the S&T area. First, in January 1979, not long after we started our formal diplomatic ties, Mr. Deng Xiaoping and the U.S. President, Mr. Carter, signed the U.S.-China Agreement on S&T cooperation. This is one of the agreements signed between the two governments when we first started our official ties. Under that umbrella agreement, the two governments and relevant agencies signed almost 50 protocols as well as memorandum of understanding to cover areas such as basic research, sanitary, education, energy, transportation, agriculture, earthquake science, and environmental protection. Based on that agreement, the first Joint Commission on S&T cooperation was held in January 1980 in Beijing. At the meeting, we talked about how to work together in terms of planning and guiding and coordinating between the two governments. Then Vice Prime Minister Mr. Fang Yi and the S&T director in the U.S. government, Mr. Frank Press, were the co-chairs of that meeting, and Mr. Deng Xiaoping was also there to witness the signing of six protocols. So 33 years have passed. The two countries have held 13 such meetings together where we have established the CERC and other major projects together. In areas such as the prevention of SARS and HIV/AIDS, we also work together by shouldering common international responsibility. The last such Joint Commission meeting was held in October 2009 in Washington, D.C. Minister of Science and Technology, Mr. Wang Gang, and Dr. Holdren from the Office of S&T Policy were the co-chairs. President Obama sent a congratulatory letter to that meeting in which he said the S&T agreement between the two countries is one of the longest existing agreements between the two countries. It is important because it helps improve the livelihood of our peoples. It proves that technology can be the bridge between two nations. In January 2011, when President Hu paid a state visit to the United States, China's S&T Minister, Mr. Wang Gang, and Dr. Holdren of the White House S&T Policy Office signed the S&T agreement to extend that agreement in the White House. And that agreement became part of the joint statement for that visit. The 14th Joint Commission meeting was held in May this year in Beijing. So about a month ago. President Hu sent a congratulatory letter to that meeting, and State Councillor Liu Yandong was there to read President Hu's letter. Based on the agreement signed between the two nations, our S&T cooperation mechanisms include the following. I have those on my slides, and I believe those are translated into English as well on the slides. I have all the details on the slides, so I'll go through these very quickly. So our cooperation mechanisms include the following. First, we have the Clean Energy Joint Research Center protocol. We have a commission to guide clean energy cooperation between the two nations. I wanted to point out that our co-chair on the Chinese side is the S&T minister and the head of NEA. And on the U.S. side, the co-chair is Dr. Chu of DOE. And our second mechanism is the Fossil Fuel Energy Protocol, Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Protocol, and the coordinators meeting for China-U.S. fossil fuel cooperation. The Chinese leader is Director General from the Ministry of S&T, and the U.S. head is the Assistant Secretary of DOE. I'm talking about these details because I want to point out how much importance has been attached to these mechanisms. The third mechanism is the Agricultural Technology Protocol, the Agricultural Technology Cooperation Joint Working Group. The Chinese head is the Vice Minister for Agricultural Technology, and the U.S. head is the Assistant Secretary of USDA. And there are many other details, including the China-U.S. Environmental Technology Cooperation Working Group, the Health and Pharmaceutical Cooperation MOU, the Youth Exchange Program, the Seismic Technology Working Group, the Ocean Technology Working Group. These are some of the mechanisms that we have in place. On to the second part of my presentation, I'd like to touch upon the major results and contents of our S&T cooperation. First, the China-U.S. Innovation Dialogue. In October 2010 and May 2011, we held the first and the second innovation dialogue between the two nations. Minister of Science and Technology Wang Gang and Dr. Holdren held the meeting together where they talked about common issues of concern. They've started investigation and analysis to look into those issues, and they have seen many good reports from experts from both sides. And the third dialogue took place in May 2012, which was about a month ago in Beijing. Minister Wang Gang and Dr. Holdren held a meeting together, and the two nations sent experts from the government, the academia, and the industry to attend this meeting. The second result or content is the Clean Energy Joint Research Center, or CERC. In 2009, we decided that both sides will invest $150 million in 5 years to support the research of electric car and clean coal, as well as energy-saving buildings. In the third round of SNED last year, American Vice President Mr. Biden and Secretary Clinton recognized the importance and the progress made by that particular center. And when President Hu visited the U.S., he participated in the signing of 16 cooperation protocols, which includes the one on CERC. And the 16 protocols amount to more than $20 billion. Thirdly, the personnel exchange program and the Youth Technology Forum. The personnel exchange program is a very important activity that is hosted by the Ministry of Science, Technology, and NSF. It started in 2004, and we have seen 8 years of success. The first round of Youth Technological Forum was held in 2011 in China, organized by the Ministry of Science and Technology and the U.S. Department of State. The goal of such forum is to facilitate the exchange of our youth in the technological area and to lay a good foundation for future cooperation. This year, we will continue with these projects and hold the second U.S.-China Youth Technological Forum in the United States.
And number 4, let's look at the U.S.-China Agricultural Joint Research Flagship projects. In November of 2011, Secretary Vilsack and Minister Wang Gang signed a letter of intent for this program. And in 2012, they will be signing a agriculture, biotechnology, water conservation technology, and gene pool collective techniques agreements, and they will be working together in those areas. In August of this year, MOST and the Department of Agriculture in Shandong will have a conference on U.S.-China agricultural science and technological cooperation. It will be their working group meeting. Number 5, in May of this year, right before the SNED, the two sides signed an MOU on science and technological cooperation in the field of environmental protection and related areas. The sixth thing is cooperation in the field of health. Our Ministry of Science and Technology has been working with HHS as well as NIH and the leaders in those organizations. We've had bilateral meetings, and we've also talked a lot about infectious diseases, epidemics, as well as a joint research center for health and medicine. We are just in the stages right now of planning such a plan to work on HIV/AIDS as well as tuberculosis. Both sides have been working really hard, and the two sides, government to government, cooperation, collaboration, and exchanges are now in-depth, stable, lasting, and we have an effective bilateral cooperative exchange mechanism. We have a broad range of fields covered. We have multi-layers, multi-levels of exchanges, diverse partnerships, and very focused and high-quality exchanges in higher energy physics, agriculture, medicine, health, marine, and fishing, earth science, atmospheric sciences, as well as physics, basic research, energy, and civilian industrial techniques, as well as geological and disaster research. We have been doing a lot of work, and our results of the work are quite encouraging. But what's even more important than that is that we have been working through all of these mechanisms and dialogues to take our research and cooperation on innovation to a higher level. We understand each other better. We don't have as many differences as we had in the past, and we have valuable consensus that have emerged. In the past, we were judgmental and critical of each other, and today we have more of a situation where there's understanding and cooperation taking the lead. We both encourage innovation. Of course, in the actual operations of how we go about it, we do different things because our countries are different, but we're working together toward joint research, data analysis, as well as trying to work on sharing of our results. Because every single country wants to innovate, and innovation doesn't know any borders. Both countries encourage cross-border cooperation, and more experts and scholars in the United States are basically understanding and more approving China's policies. We are spending more and more on our basic research and developing our talents because we are quite successful. We are showing our success. You can say that the cooperative relationship between the two of us is building up strategic trust, which is promoting improvements in science and technology and bringing better lives to the people, as well as more and more people-to-people exchanges. The third thing to discuss here is evaluating science and technological cooperation and some expectations for the future. Both the United States and China attach a lot of importance to cooperation in the science and technology realm. President Obama and President Hu, in both 2009 as well as 2012, sent congratulatory messages to the joint Science and Technology Commission meetings. And at the Innovation Dialogue, as well as the Joint Commission recently, we could see from how high level the participation was, how diverse the participation was, and how broad an array of topics that there was. We could see how much they both attach importance to all of this. We cooperate on a rich array of topics. We have excellent results, and all of that is a key force, driving force in promoting overall relations between our two countries, which is a very pragmatic cooperative relationship as it exists today, and it's also a good driving force and an important part of the U.S.-China partnership itself. Scientific and technological cooperation between our two countries has been pretty smooth from start till up until now, from the time it started up until now. Sometimes it's affected by other factors, but not as much as other areas of the bilateral relationship. You could say that it's a really relatively stable area of cooperation between our two sides. It's been very productive. our cooperative relationship, and it's been good for China. Looking at the statistics from some of our government entities who have provided statistics, there are a lot of theses and papers that have come out of China as a result of cooperating with the United States. And it's not just that the United States has been supporting China in these areas. We have also, in addition to getting this support, we've learned advanced managerial methodologies, and our whole system of administration for science and technology is much better than it was in the past. It's a beneficial relationship that is win-win for both of us. Our researchers and scholars have been working in food security, chronic diseases, infectious diseases, climate change, stem cells, high-energy physics, and other areas. We've been joining hands and working together, trying to work on difficult problems such as neutrinos and the uses of nuclear energy. And our cooperation has been in-depth. Recently, in the area of clean cook stoves, high-speed rail, agricultural technology, fourth-generation nuclear energy, and health technologies, China has been using its own advantages in these areas to work with the United States, providing even new breakthroughs for S&T cooperation between us with companies like the ENN Group, DQY Ecological, Suntech, and Huaneng. Those are excellent representatives, typical representatives of this type of cooperation. And we have noted that there are some Americans that are quite concerned with our indigenous innovation and our IPR protection policies. So my colleague, Mr. Liu Yanhua, talked specifically about this in his presentation. I'm not going to go into it again here. I would just like to talk a little bit about my personal experiences in these areas. Many years ago, I was the ambassador to Geneva, to some of the international organizations. I represented China at an international organization there, and I did a lot with IPR activities. I was the ambassador to WIPO, and I know that China has been an active participant in many of these agreements, actively more than many other countries. And in WIPO, under the guidance of WIPO, we have been able to build up our capacity in our country, including our whole system and of many mechanisms to protect IPR. And I'll give you also another very simple example. Our highest level of policymakers, the Politburo of our Communist Party, that is, meets regularly to learn more about these issues. In the past few years, they have already met over 20 times on these issues to learn more, to get to know what's going on. And I have had the honor and pleasure to participate. And the time that I was there, it was about protecting IPR rights as well as the patent system. Because they had the SIPO leaders and the leaders in the patent industry talking there about the whole system and what we're doing to protect patents and IPR. I'm just using this as an example to show you that the leaders in China attach a lot of importance to the protection of IPR. China now and in the past attached a lot of importance to that, and we've been working with the United States in the area of education, legislation, and oversight. But protecting IPR is something that we have to work together on. We hope that we can work according to the principle of non-discrimination and that we can support industry and researchers working together across boundaries in depth more than ever before, exchanging, collaborating, cooperating, and learning each other's successful models and taking those successful models into more and more areas of our economy. So finally, I would just like to say here that I myself was in diplomacy for 30 years. So my presentation probably should show that. You can tell, maybe. However, I would just like to say one more thing, that before being in diplomacy, I, in the past, worked in space research for several years. And so I do have some experience personally in the area of science and technological innovation. I'm not a total outsider in that area. So I feel that this topic, that I brought that to my speech in this topic. I hope you were able to get to know that. Thank you, everyone.
So actually, thank you, Vice Minister, for that actually wonderful presentation, because in a sense it really is useful to go back and look, just like with a fine Chinese carpet, is to see the web and weft of agreements that there are that really hold the cooperation together. And for the United States and China, this web and weft actually is very important. However, also it depends very much on the skill of the individual weavers who actually knot the wool on the web and weft that actually will create the richness of the patterns. And some are richer, some are poorer. And I think a great deal of praise also goes for the individual researchers who actually find a way to develop these patterns. And I think to some degree, Professor Sadmaier's presentation actually presented this other aspect of S&T cooperation, which is actually how the weavers, how the other people, the other folks in the science and technology cooperation ecosystem actually produce the actual results of S&T cooperation. So I would like to, we saw, actually witnessed two widely different presentations. One is the one on how the structures of government actually provide a framework for S&T cooperation. And in the case of U.S.-China cooperation, these structures are extremely rich. And also, on the other hand, Dr. Sadmaier emphasized the role of personal relations and the role of institutional relations in promoting S&T cooperation. So I would like to, and there's a third issue I think that Vice Minister Chow brought at the end, is that no ecosystem can function if there is a preponderance of predators. So I think in any ecosystem, predator control is very important. And so one of the issues that I think there has been a problem with the relation with China is predation in intellectual property. So I think to the degree actually that he actually emphasizes the role of the State Council and pay attention to these issues is something I think that also would be important to discuss. And then finally, any vice minister that mentions the word neutrino is my friend. So let's start the discussion. We will be happy to take questions.
May I have the mic?
My question is aimed at Dr. Sundermeyer, Professor Sundermeyer. In talking about scientific and technological innovation, in China, we're talking about tying S&T to the economy. In other words, innovation has to have a goal. When we talk about collaboration in S&T, it also has to have a goal. It has to have something that it's pursuing, that it's working on. Of course, you need to have common interests taken care of. The Chinese want to work with the United States because in the world, as you look at the world, the United States is one of the greatest innovators, So my question is, why is it that the United States wants to cooperate with China in science and technology? What's your goal in cooperating with us? That's my question for you. Great question.
It is a very interesting question, and I think the way I would answer it is in terms of a longer pattern of change. So one reason for starting with 1979 and that first slide was, I think at that time the overwhelming interest was more political, I would argue. You know, if we think back at that time in terms of the geopolitics, this was an opportunity to take advantage of using science and technology as a diplomatic tool, I would say. And I think it was very important, actually, in leading to the normalization of relations, even before 1979. As time goes on, however, I think that has changed. So I think it is true, as Minister Chao pointed out, that this relationship is really unique. The science and technology relationship is unique, I think, in being as stable as it has been. You know, I have a friend at the Academy of Sciences who would always say that, you know, the political relationships was like the tide, you know, go up and down, and but when the tide is low, you can still see the rocks that hold the relationship together, which is the S&T relationship. So, but I think that at this point, it's a mixture of political interests, common global commons questions such as energy and environment, innovation possibilities that are beneficial to the United States. Back in the early days, I think one of the appeals was that China offered very distinctive problems for research, just in terms of China's geography, its genetic pool. There are a number of things like that that I think attracted U.S. investigators. So I would say it's a mixed bag, but over time, the actual sense of mutual benefit from the relationship has increased, and the scientific and technological benefits have increased relative to the political ones. Finally, I think it's fair to say we have to recognize how important Chinese scientists, students and scientists are for the health of the U.S. research enterprise, right? Given our problems with education, if we did not have ethnic Chinese scientists working in our laboratories and teaching in our universities, we would be a much poorer country.
Thank you. Actually, Professor Sotomayor actually emphasized the fact that the mantra that I always heard and I always promulgated when I was Science Counselor in Beijing, and I continue to promulgate, is that there has been really extraordinary mutual benefit in the U.S.-China S&T relationship. And that mutual benefit continues. It's a reason one can perform experiments in China in the scale that one could never perform in the United States. China actually presents a unique environment in order to do the experiments. Coming back to my favorite topic, neutrino, actually neutrino oscillation experiment would never have been possible anywhere else, because only in China you have 4 reactors of 1 gigawatt each producing neutrinos that actually ignite those. You can gather statistics in China much faster than you can anywhere else in the world. It's a question of geography, population. The environment is there to promote great enterprises and S&T cooperation.
Steve Barrell with the National Academy of Sciences. I have a perhaps undiplomatic question, but I want to address it to Pete as well. And that is that, as we all know, and you know especially well, U.S. government funding for bilateral S&T cooperation, not only with China, but with all parts of the world, is in short supply and has been for a long time, is occasionally suspect. In political circles, it tends to be viewed as an expense, not a way of leveraging U.S. resources. And one cannot be at all optimistic about the future. So my question is, in light of the increasingly robust relationships you describe between investigators, between academic institutions, in the industrial level, does that matter any longer, or does it matter as much that we underfund formal cooperation?
Yeah, that's another good question. It kind of goes to the my last slide there about raising the question of what is the role of government-to-government programs in providing this framework. I do think that in some ways the commercial and the academic exchanges or platforms, if you will, have become so robust that you could maybe make the argument that the government funding is not as important. But on the other hand, we shouldn't underestimate the importance of that framework, and we shouldn't underestimate the importance of the kinds of work that goes on under it. I mean, you know, from the beginning, the U.S. position has always been that most of this funding has to come out of the budgets of the science agencies, and they have to justify those expenditures for international activities, including those with China, on the basis of whether it serves their domestic missions. And I think there's a certain attractive discipline to that that has served us pretty well on paper, I mean on balance. But I also think that there are some areas where that's just not enough and where we really have to think of this as an investment. And I mean, it's interesting because I think in policy terms, there is more realization now in terms of foreign policy of the importance of international science and technology, just at the time when, in fact, the resource situation is becoming scarcer. So I think it does matter. You know, the thing that I keep coming back to is, I think, the ill-advised approach of Congress with regard to funding OSTP. Now, it's not funding research, but somebody in this government has to be in a position to coordinate and give direction to this multifaceted kind of relationship, and the logical place is OSTP. So cutting back on funding for OSTP, it seems to me, is very ill-advised because it sort of has the effect of saying, well, we don't really want to maximize our opportunities from this thing. We'll just squander them. And, you know, can all those, the benefits be realized only through the academic and commercial channels? I think not, precisely because there are sort of common public goods issues that come up out of these relationships that really require active government attention. And it may not only be research, but it is research related to policy and coordination.
Back there?
Yes. Yes, I'm Bruce Lehman. I'm the president of the International Intellectual Property Institute. And back in the 90s, I was very much involved in intellectual property diplomacy as a member of the Clinton administration. I worked with Kent Hughes and others in the Commerce Department. And my question, I guess, is initially addressed to Minister Chen and also to other members of the panel if they would like to respond. And that is that there's been a lot of reference to intellectual property issues here. But I'd like to just, bring us back a little bit to the context of the 90s when the U.S. and China first engaged on these issues. And that was in the context of bilateral negotiations for China to adhere to the WTO treaty and its TRIPS provisions. And as I see it, and I think that was the understanding of the Clinton administration at the time, that the equation there, the quid pro quo, was that the United States would permit China to have virtually unfettered access to U.S. markets so that it could exploit its comparative advantage in the cost of labor. And so very quickly after the trade barriers were reduced, we saw the loss of virtually the last vestiges of a lot of consumer manufacturing in the United States. But I think that the quid pro quo that we expected was that we would have a better advantage in the Chinese market for what we saw as our comparative advantage, and that was what President Clinton referred to as the high-wage, high-tech jobs that were largely supported by the intellectual property system. And whereas there's been no question that China has certainly made progress in developing an infrastructure for the protection of intellectual property rights, as a practical matter, those rights are not sufficiently recognized and enforced in China so that the United States is able to effectively exploit its comparative advantage, the comparative advantage that was a part of this quid pro quo. And that's produced a tremendous tension. It's, I would say, the greatest tension between the United States and China right now is the trade imbalance that we have. And that's particularly a problem given the current economic situation in the United States and the world. So I would appreciate the response you know, of the minister on that issue, since he's been involved in this diplomacy, and particularly as his view as to whether there really is a recognition in the leadership in Beijing that this is not just simply a question of waiting 30 years for China to have an advanced intellectual property system when it owns all the intellectual property rights, or whether there's a sense of urgency and an understanding that this is really a part of the bargain that was struck with the United States at the time that we basically agreed to open our markets to Chinese manufactured products, which has been a very, very successful thing for China and been very much a part of its economic growth.
On the protection of IPR in China and its relevant situation, Mr. Liu Yanhua actually touched upon this, and I also talked about it a bit. So from the government point of view, I have to say that we put a lot of emphasis into this area. I also gave you 2 examples just now. I can say that whether it is from the policies or education for the public, as well as regulation or monitoring of IPR protection from the government's point of view, we are making a lot of efforts. We're doing a lot. Let me give you another example. Just a few years ago, a lot of the software that is used were illegal. And the government, what the Chinese government did was using an administration order to prohibit those illegitimate software. Anyone who uses illegitimate software will be punished. That is one of the work that has been done by the government. So starting from 0 to what we are today, we have to go through this process in protecting IPR. And I think our pace is relatively quick. The IPR infringement cases that I have heard so far, including pirated DVDs, pirated movies, pirated T-shirts, these are there. We have those problems, but our relevant agencies are now doing their best to crack down on those crimes. But in terms of major technology and the IPR infringements on that, I don't think I've ever heard of any cases. Maybe just a few, but these sporadic cases don't really mean that the Chinese companies or relevant organizations are infringing upon IPR rights. That's my answer. I'll just follow up. To follow up on what Mr. Chao said, IPR protection is important. Around the world, starting from the 90s, people started paying even more attention to that. We started our reform and opening up around the 80s. And throughout this process, this reform and economic development process, we are going really fast. But in this very short time, we have seen so many problems that have occurred in, say, the 100 years of development in the U.S. So our solutions might come later. We have to admit that. But if you compare China to advanced countries, there are things that we are lacking. That is true. But like what Mr. Chao said, you have to look at also the time since the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. If you just look at China as a country, look at China itself, we are going pretty fast. And that includes our protection of IPR. We do see problems occurring, but every time we see a new issue or a new challenge taking place, we will have solution to solve them. That is what we're trying to do as we step up our development. We have to have this process. We admit that we are still lagging behind compared to other countries, but if you just look at China itself, we are doing pretty well. And secondly, exactly because we do have some shortages in terms of IP protection in China, but we do have opportunities for our businesses. Take software, for example. When Microsoft first came into China, it was very expensive. The Windows system was very expensive. And at that time, the average Chinese person's income was too low to afford any software. So many Chinese companies, as well as foreign companies, made these so-called pirated software, and they installed those in our computers. It spread so fast. It was so rapid. You can't even imagine. In just a few years, hundreds of millions of people got used to the Windows system, and they could not live without it anymore afterwards. So what happened was the Chinese government ordered the legitimate use of this software afterwards, and at that time, Chinese people were already used to the Windows system, so now they have to buy legitimate copies. So you have to look at this from the long-term point of view as well. In addition, the Chinese government has always been trying to support the Chinese kind of operating system. But that system did not really become popular in China. Nowadays, we use Microsoft operating system in China. So you can also look at it from that point of view. IPR is a double-edged sword. It has its upside, but it could be negative sometimes. So you have to look at it from a historical point of view to look at it more broadly. This is something really that merits our research. Just a few words. In our exchange or engagement with other countries, and as well as in our own development, we see many challenges. One is climate change. as we develop so rapidly, we are emitting a lot of carbon. So in China, our people see this as a very urgent issue. And internationally, we are also looking at this climate change issue. And the second issue would be the IPR issue, particularly in the exchange with the United States. Issues like this, when we look at these, you have to know that the Chinese government sees this more urgently than any other person. They take this more seriously than any other would do. In the past few years, emissions reduction have been one of our national goals. We have taken up a lot of risks and paid a lot of costs. It's the same with IPR. I think more Chinese companies have been victimized by this IPR infringement issue, maybe more so than foreign companies. We are trying to protect IPR, not because we're pressured by other countries. It's also because we are trying to develop our own economy. So what we want to see the most is, well, for example, to solve the climate change issue, we want to work together with you on researching new technology or new energy to promote our efforts in that area. And it's the same with IPR protection. We want to work with you. We want to learn from you. For example, in China, we have also the problem with poisonous food. Well, you probably don't have this in the U.S. In China, our government is doing a lot to crack down on those poisonous food. It's the same with IPR protection. As soon as we see any problem, the Chinese government will take action. So in our dialogue, we always say there are so many pirated products in China. Some people always make it sound like it's the problem with the government. It's the government that's not taking enough action. But that's not true. What we want to do is to learn from you and to work with you. We have a very steadfast position in that regard.
One of the questions that I had was that basically to what degree is the State Council engaging in promoting the intellectual property rights of the Chinese people themselves, actually, because to some degree also violation of intellectual property within China is a barrier to innovation because it actually reduces the incentives to innovation. But now what I want to do is I want to share an anecdote because once I had lunch with Bill Gates and it happened to be at the ambassador residence with Bill Gates had come to visit China, and Ambassador Roy invited him, and I was present at lunch. And the question that came up to Bill Gates was, are you worried about people stealing the Windows operating system? And he said, let them steal it. It will become the standard. So you have confirmed, actually, Bill Gates' vision that the Windows operating system, and it's really quite interesting that in that regards, how the idea that you could have an operating system like Windows and the Chinese inventiveness of laying an overlay on the Windows system that allowed Chinese computers to operate in Chinese really made it possible actually for personal computers to really spread like wildfire in China. They never really did spread in the same way either in Russia or in India for that matter. So any more questions? We want a vigorous debate on this intellectual property issue.
Way in the back.
Way in the back? Where are?
I'm Rayanne Havasey from the Center for Science, Teaching and Learning. And thanks today for this. This is wonderful. Those of us in the scientific community feel very strongly that our PR efforts are not great in communicating to the public the importance of science and technology, and therefore when agencies like OSTP get underfunded, we feel that we're not doing a good job in getting the public to understand the importance. Now, as China and the United States really begin to work together more than ever in the world of science and technology, Do any of you see this as an issue that we need to face now before things go too much further, and that is communicating to those of us, particularly in the U.S., the public, the importance of this relationship in terms of science and technology?
I think the way I would respond to that is just, to make reference to an observation by Secretary of Energy Stephen Chu about after assuming his position as secretary and then beginning to engage with China and visit China more often, his response was, the United States is facing a Sputnik moment. And the interesting thing, I think, is that we don't really quite see China's scientific and technological development as a single event that is very dramatic like Sputnik, but instead a process that is building on a fast, rapidly rising learning curve. But it's very difficult to kind of get the full impact of a Sputnik moment, even though he's probably right that it is a Sputnik moment and we should be responding accordingly.
Any more questions back there?
The microphone's not. Minister Qiao and Minister Liu answered very well, I think, just now, and they were telling everyone all about how, in addition to protecting IPR and really working hard on that area and working on the rule of law, that's all been said, and that's all true. Because we do experience IPR in dealing with other countries, but we have a lot of that inside of China, domestically as well. We have more and more cases in our highest level courts, Supreme Courts, and local courts. In the early days, in the past, they were at just regular level courts, maybe civil courts. That's where we dealt with IPR cases. But then there have been motions that were brought up, and we are now having pilots to have IPR courts themselves, IPR judges themselves that are in charge of these IPR cases. What we are trying to do is have a larger consultative committee or commission above that, composed of experts who understand economics, science, and technology related to aspects of these cases, because the judge might really know law very well, but he might not know technology that well. So he has to get the advice from that type of a commission of experts. So in the area of laws and in our judicial area, we are doing a lot, and that shows that we in our government are working hard to ensure the protection of IPR. We are making it more and more of an important task. Thank you, everyone.
Well, two more questions. If anybody is courageous enough to ask, stand between us and lunch. So let's have two more questions here, and then we will be done. Anyone out there? 1, 2, 3. I guess lunch wins. Okay, folks.